She just started the recording.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Excellent.
Linnea. I'd like to thank Linnea, who's our tech support today. And I'd like to let you know a little bit. We have these discussion groups every month, usually on the third Thursday of the month. And my name is Jill Hoffman. I work with International Services in the Northern California coastal region of the Red Cross. And today I'm very excited because Susan Burgess-Lent is an old, I don't mean by age, but I
Well,
mean
that
by
too.
timing, old friend of mine. She and I started, we years and years ago, we both went through international delegate training at the same time. There were there were 28 of us, and only 9 of us got to go overseas, and she was one of them. She actually, and most people don't know this, she debriefed me when I came back from the Bosnian War. She and her Hefe counterpart took me out to a restaurant where I cried the entire lunch, and I will never forget it. What wonderful listeners they were. But in any case, she has had a lot of experience working overseas. She worked in Rwanda with the Rwandan response. She also worked in Darfur in the early conflict hours. And Maria, I'm going to ask you to take your face off only because of the bandwidth. We have, I think, about 100 people. So thank you. In any case, she worked in um, in Darfur for peace and development. She's worked for international services at national headquarters for 5 or 6 years in her early years. And I don't mean early in age, again, in her early years of international work. And now she's a board member of um, I think it's Women's International. You want
Women's
to say?
Centers International.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Women's Center
Actually, I
International,
founded it. I'm not on the board anymore, though.
and she's written 2 books. So I'm going to let her introduce it. What did I leave out? I left out a lot, Susan.
Yeah, it's a busy life, but you got the high
The
points.
question I always ask speakers at the beginning is, what did you think you were going to be when you were in high school?
Well, I didn't have a clue, to be honest with you. My father thought I should be a writer, which is where I'm going. Um, but let me get started with what I wanted to say about Sudan. I have followed my heart pretty much with Sudan and followed the developments. I was there during the first genocide in the mid 2000s, and 20 years ago, same. Well, difference. There's difference I'll talk about. But I have friends. I don't know what happened to them. They're in places like El Fasher, which is the only city in Darfur that hasn't been taken by the rebels, the Rapid Support Forces. And right now, to me, Sudan is like the perfect storm of civil wars. It is so complex, it hurts my head to think about it. And this is a country that was basically in really bad shape before it started last April, with like 15 million people facing food insecurity, another 4 million people displaced. And I'm not clear now if those displaced people have been displaced again, is probably the case. To me, it's they're in a really rough neighborhood, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And also, this particular civil war has all the hallmarks of a genocide, and nobody's calling it that yet. But what's different this time is that there are a lot more weapons of various descriptions involved, and they're still leveraging, in my opinion, old grievances, where the first genocide was really about beginning Arab domination of Black Africans, which is what the Darfur population primarily is. Now it's countrywide. They're blowing up the whole country. Okay, Linnea, can you give me the page 1 of the slides? I is when I first heard that they were bombing, blowing up things in Khartoum, I thought, oh, here we go. And it's the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, they call them, um, against the Sudanese armed forces. These guys were in bed with each other, basically. That's kind of crude. Um, they were buddies until they disagreed on some really important things about who was controlling what territory. That's when things broke out. I want to give you a general picture of just how extensive this is. Can we see the next one? Okay, no, back up one more. Back up. Yeah, there we go. So, dead? No, there, stay there. Injured. The statistic that interests me in particular is the rapes. They don't have a good handle on this, but they estimate at least 80% of the women have been raped. Displaced, that's the population, the displaced both internally and refugees, that's bigger than the population of New York City. That's how many people are on the move. And then the famine that has affected 2.5, that population of Chicago. All of the people in Chicago have no food. Imagine. That's what we're talking about in terms of impact on civilians. Then, Linnea, next one, please. And then we're talking about the really terrible impact on infrastructure. Again, we have the Sudanese armed forces versus the rapid support forces. Back up, please. RSF, these people, the RSF, are the former Janjaweed of the first genocide. They got the same guys running the show that did it 20 years ago. This is, anyway, there's been bombing, there's been arson. They burned down most of El Geneina, the capital of West Darfur. They've been looting both homes, businesses, and any kind of aid storage of like foods, tarps, things like that. Hospitals, clinics, schools, the schools that my former organization, Darfur Peace and Development, built in El Fasher was bombed. Homes and businesses gone. So we're talking essentially, we have major systems collapsing all across the board. And we've had crop failures because of the movement of people and military. And they like to pile on in Darfur, in Sudan. They had a major flood in August that I don't know the statistics on what happened. The pictures are pretty revealing that whole areas were flooded, which means crops, people, food were all taken away. And then we have waterborne diseases like cholera. So Sudan gets piled on all the time. Okay, so the next one. Oh, I forgot about, they also do enormous damage with all the fires that they've created throughout. There's a map that I found that terrified me when I looked at it. The number of fires all around Darfur, they were so dense that there were big red sections. And I thought, ooh, you know, the air quality, to say nothing of all the destruction. Okay, now we're looking at what I call a rough neighborhood. We have 7 fragile states. We have Egypt, Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, all taking flows of refugees. Weapons are moving through, and mercenaries are coming through, especially from the West. Mali and Niger, they're picking up huge numbers of young men fighters. The Russians are sending in mercenaries from, this is the Wagner group, nasty people. they are, I don't know if the guy that used to run Wagner Group, forgot his name. He was killed by probably one of his people. But the Wagner Group is notorious for teaching some of the most destructive ways to prosecute a war. And I would not want to know that they were in my neighborhood. So we're looking at also in this weapons flow. Egypt is supplying these Sudanese armed forces. Iran is too. Saudi Arabia is kind of trying to be nice and just send rifles and stuff, and they're trying to broker a peace. The United Arab Emirates, they're sending bullets, drones. This is a neighborhood full of weapons, right? I want to go over this just a tiny bit too, so hold on here. So both sides are using anti-materiel rifles, which means they use them against military equipment like tanks, equipment holding structures, other kinds of hardware. Those are the targets of those things. Drone jammers and drones, mortars. An unguided mortar costs about $2,000 a round, and the GPS guided precision ones cost about 18 grand. Anti-tank guided missiles, 10,000 a shot. Truck mounted multi-barrel rocket launchers. Both sides are using all of these weapons at enormous cost. Now, the RSF is using something called a man-pad. I thought, oh, such a name. They're basically a man-portable air defense system. I think they're actually drones. They come from the UAE and from Russia's Wagner Group. Armored personnel carriers are coming from the United Arab Emirates. I mean, we have a supermarket of weapons flooding Sudan. And everybody, except the Sudanese civilians, are taking it on the chin. You know, I mean, the Sudanese civilians are the ones that are taking it on the chin. Everybody else is making money. Here's another piece that I didn't know until about a year ago is Sudan has a lot of gold, but in Darfur, there's a particularly lucrative mine that's run by the RSF, and they send it off through the United Arab Emirates to be kind of converted into cash to buy more weapons. The UAE is trying to be very careful about looking as if they're just sitting on the sidelines, but in fact, they're heavily involved in moving money and weapons. Also, a fair amount of supplies are stolen from anybody that tries to bring in humanitarian aid, often by the RSF. I think that the Army is not immune to that, but the RSF is more likely to do it. So this is the general configuration of all the players that are feeding.
Susan, would you share what RFS stands for? SF
The
stands
Rapid
for
Support Forces. That's the Janjaweed, rebranded. Okay, the militia. Okay, next page here. I really want to talk for a minute about what nobody talks about right now is genocide. All the conditions currently exist in Sudan to call it that. However, as with the first time around, it took a long time. This time it's taking even longer and it's more in your face. The problem with the Genocide Convention is that it never, as far as I can read it, never suggested, okay, here are the indicators. When you tick them off, and could be any of these, when you tick them off and you have a whole group of them, that means you have a genocide. What do we do? What does this mean? Is our responsibility? Do we put boots on ground? What do we do to make it stop? And this is why the Darfur, the Rwandan genocide consumed over 1 million lives, because nobody was willing to call it that. And this is happening again and again, and I don't know what it's going to take to change this. In related to this is both the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces have been added to the annual UN blacklist for perpetrators of grave violations against children. They've been named for violations committed last year, killing and maiming children, attacking schools and hospitals, and for sexual violence and recruiting and using children in their ranks. Now, the other people that are putting a lot of money into this are the humanitarian aid groups. And as much as I love the whole world of humanitarian relief and its intent to relieve suffering, most of the organizations that work in Sudan are based in Europe or the US. Nobody is supporting the Sudanese organizations. Therefore, ultimately, they don't gain any traction. So when, it stops, whenever it stops, they are still left without the ability. The capacity has not been built for them to continue their work. They're the main people that have an investment in how things go. When I was there in the mid 2000s, I was able to move around quite freely among the UN offices, and mainly because I'm a white woman and I'm an American. I'm sure those were big factors here. But they treated my colleagues that I was working with as if they were guests in their own country. This happens time and time again in these situations where the people most affected are not put in charge. And this is one of my real pet peeves. Anyway, let's move on. The next one is peace talks. Delegates from all over the United States, Saudi Arabia, all these people show up. The warring partners did not. They just thumbed their noses at him. Actually, I heard that the RSF people actually came to Geneva but didn't show up at the peace talks. They went on vacation or something. I don't know. The good news for this is also there's a contingent of Sudanese women that are being involved. There's going to be some more. They're going to try it again. Maybe they'll get luckier. But I'm impressed with this woman, Intisar Abdul Sadiq, a senior advisor at the Search for Common Ground. I think that she is going to be a major mover and shaker in how this plays out. And there, of course, women are focusing on gender-based violence, which is off the charts, and also the basic humanitarian needs of women and children, which is food, shelter, water. All right. Last thing here is, Linnea, next, please. The Security Council renewed another embargo on the warring parties, and the Army allowed aid to come in. You can see there's a lot of trucks, but they're going to feed about 30,000 people, which was a break in the action. And that's a minor number of people who need their help. Okay, so is there any good news in all this? Last slide, please. These are the survivors. Sudan is a young population. They have a thing called cartoon kitchens. I have always been impressed by the enormous and graceful hospitality of the Sudanese. There wasn't anything they wouldn't do for you when you show up, just like, eat, let me get this, let me get that. And I love that about their generosity. Now we're looking at a whole generation that's only known war. the thing that the Sudanese in Khartoum have done is called Khartoum Kitchens, which is whenever they can get food from any place, they cook it up and they let everybody in the neighborhood know to come over and eat. That's the Sudanese way. Everybody supports everybody else. That is one thing that will certainly carry them through. But I've got to ask, what leverage do those of us outside of this catastrophe, what leverage do we have to change the course of this crisis and relieve these long-suffering people of the burden of two soulless men fighting it out for land and power? I don't know. I wish I knew. But I do know that the people who are on the ground that deserve the most support are Sudanese based. And I don't know, the first time around, they had this whole thing with Save Darfur and people on the streets, and there was a big thing on the mall in Washington. There was public outrage about what was happening. This time, you can't even, it's hard to find major news coverage of this. So what do we do? I don't know. But I'm open to questions now because I've spent my 30 minutes. Thank you all.
Please feel free to ask a question or to comment on what Susan said, or ask her about any part of her journey to ending up working in the Sudan. And she also, at the end, if we haven't gotten to it yet, Susan, I'd love for you to talk about what you did in Oakland with the Oakland Center eventually.
Oakland.
But let's open it up to questions so far. Joanne, go ahead. You need to unmute. Joanne, you need to unmute. There should be a little button. It should be where your microphone is. It shouldn't have a line around it. So undo that. Just click on the microphone and undo it. Or you can put your question in the chat, Joanne.
I just put some things in the chat that are resources that I think you'd be interested in. Situation reports, for example, relief web maps, situation reports, detailed stuff. It'll amaze you.
Yeah. Okay. There you go, Joanne. Go for
it. I think are doing some work. That
yeah, I just wanted to say I identified. Oh, there's an echo.
Go ahead.
I identify with your cause because I was a person that was asked to help with Darfur back last time, and so I wrote curriculum, and I worked with our local Jewish community and the Holocaust Museum, and at that time George Clooney, the unknown George Clooney, right, that was before he got married, was very much empowered. Is the Holocaust Museum these days interesting? Because they really knew how to organize and get legislation through, and I just wondered, it's because so much of it sounds, oh my gosh, it's happening again. It sounds so much like what was happening before.
I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know if this is tracking with the Holocaust Museum.
I could share a little bit if that's helpful, Susan. The Holocaust Museum is working, but not it in and of itself. We used to have, through Restoring Family Links, work with Holocaust survivors, and there is a list of resources that we can send next week to you, where you can get in contact with the Holocaust Museum and ask them specifically that question.
What? Do we have an echo going on here? Do we have an echo?
Yeah, we do. If anybody is, I think, Maria, if you could mute yourself. Thank you.
I think I took care of it.
Perfect. Thank you, Linnea. Okay. At any rate, we'll get that resource to you, Joanne. Go ahead, Susan. I'm sorry.
I mean, the bigger question is who's really in charge of forming a policy, I mean, about genocide. I mean, I don't really know. I can't find. It would seem that it would fall to the UN, but can the UN get cooperation that says, especially when they're blocked in the Security Council, that says, okay, we have a genocide and we want all you people to put boots on the ground right now and make it stop. I think that'll go over like a lead balloon. Nobody wants boots on the ground in a place like that, except people who stand to gain. I wish that I knew how to affect change in policy about what do you do when the conditions are met. That's what we don't do. It's not the only genocide that's ongoing either. So
Yeah.
it seems kind of
That's why I was so impressed with the Holocaust Museum, because they were on top of tracking all government, our government activities and pushing. Our government was not willing to recognize genocide. Because of course, according to the convention, if you recognize genocide, you have to act to
do
stop it.
something. Right.
Yeah. And that was preventing them. But maybe at this point, given what's going on in Palestine, maybe the Holocaust Museum has different, I don't know what they're doing with regard to that, and that might be taking up their energies.
Well, it's interesting that South Africa has raised the issue with the courts.
Yeah,
I don't know the status of that either. But
I'm wondering if Joanne, you could put your questions or your comments in the chat, because when you speak, we're having an echo
Okay.
with your computer. That would be great. And then I'd like to open it up to other people to ask questions while Joanne's putting her questions in the chat. Any other questions or comments about what Susan said? Katrina Barlow mentioned that in the chat, Economist magazine from August 29, 2024 has an excellent article about how complex and dire the situation is. So if you look up Economist magazine, August 29, 2024, you'll find out more information about the Sudan. For those of you who are interested, it's in the chat.
Yeah, it was a good article. The main coverage comes from like The Economist, Al Jazeera, Arab news outlets, and there are some in Sudan. I don't think that American news usually covers things like this unless something really, really bloody happens. That's our media. I'm a little, I used to work in the US media, so I kind of know how they think about these things. And I remember working in news during the first genocide and kept going to them saying, hey, Sudan. And they would roll their eyes and say, where is that? And granted, this is local news, but the indifference of US media to crises overseas never fails to disappoint. And I think that if you really want to know what's going on, you have to go outside of the US media to find out. And BBC is really terrific on many fronts. And my feeling is that anytime you see a bunch of statistics, you kind of have to compare like 3 different sources to see if they kind of line up, because in something this tremendous, it's hard to have reliable statistics. One can guess that, yeah, well, there's 10 million people on the move, but how do you know that, you know? So I think that different sources will give you different ideas about the numbers, but the fact of the matter is that this is a crisis beyond what we have seen even in the recent past, much less 20 years ago when Darfur was suffering a genocide. This is way outside what we should be tolerating as a species, in my opinion.
I'm wondering if there's any other questions that people wanted to share. Joanne put in the chat information about George Clooney and the Holocaust Museum. But I also wanted to share this time to talk with you, since you didn't just work in Sudan, but you've also worked in Kenya. Would you talk about Women's Shelters International? Would you be willing to talk about the organization that you helped create?
Yeah, it's the organization is Women's Centers International.
Thank you.
And it was actually born in Darfur during the time that I worked there in the mid 2000s. The women there taught me everything that I needed to know about how to help women in conflict zones. They told you got to listen. You got to go in and you got to listen. And they told me what they needed, and I did my best. I think I made 5 or 6 trips there over the course of the same number of years. And every time I would be like a mule carrying things over there that they said they needed, but they couldn't get locally. And I mean, small things, like I remember we were trying to light the center, but not too brightly. And I found some really wonderful solar lights, right? They were really like excited about that. They liked there was a kind of whistle that you can buy that you can hear like across town. And they didn't want to use it because they were used by the people who would come out to rape women looking for firewood. So that wasn't so good. But there were many. That center taught me so much about how to work with women. I took that lesson to Nairobi. Nairobi is moving it around in Kenya. We have a center in Uganda, one in Zimbabwe. And these are all in poor areas, in slums, really. It's like 60% of Nairobi is slum. And so it's not hard to find a lot of women who need help. The idea of the center is to create a safe place, first of all, because safety is what really goes out the window in violent environments for women. They can come there and they can learn various skills. They can participate in groups that discuss how they're navigating the traumas that occur, that are inherent in extreme poverty. They learn so much. When they come together, it's a remarkable thing to see. We started one in Oakland, my hometown, and it had about 240 women involved, and these were women on the low end of the economic scale primarily. It was a fabulous place. I loved that place. We couldn't continue it because nobody wanted to raise money to support it. It's hard raising money for women, I'll tell you that. As much as we hear talk about the importance of equipping women with the support they need to advance in the world, it's not happening in a lot of places. And I see that these women's centers are like a launch place for women in the community who come in and they learn skills, they develop their ability to resolve the crises in their lives, they become movers and shakers in their community ultimately. It's a beautiful thing to see. And my vision at the beginning was that it should be a global network, but it takes a while. It takes a while. I'm real happy with 5 right now.
There's a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to share with you.
Okay.
From Jonathan, Susan, his question is, considering that neutrality is a fundamental principle of the Red Cross movement, what's your assessment of how the Sudanese Red Crescent is being supported by IFC, and are there related other NGOs that you know of in Sudan or advocacy organizations that are leading the way where RC and or the Red Cross movement isn't able to?
That's a good question. I think the Sudanese Red Crescent has been a rigorous country, what do they call it? Society. They have many locations where they work. I think that I did read recently that a driver for them had been killed in the fighting, and I'm not clear because the website doesn't tell you much what exactly they're able to do under the current Wild West scenarios that are happening in Sudan and Darfur. I think that my experience is that the Red Cross can do things that nobody else can do, but as with many aid organizations, they become targets. So I confess my ignorance of exactly what they're doing in Sudan.
And Jonathan, I'll try to get you some information on that and send it up in our follow-up email next week. But also, I wanted to share with you something that Susan mentioned about and I think it's really important, if you ask people what their needs are, they will tell you. If you make assumptions about what you think they need, you are hopeless in helping sometimes.
Exactly
And
right.
one of the things that I think that you haven't mentioned is the use of solar heaters and how that saved women from having to go out and find firewood.
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple of different things going on around cooking, which is women's domain primarily, and you don't really want to go out and gather firewood in any of these environments. The solar cookers was an initiative back when, where they could actually get cardboard and foil and, make them. We taught them how to make them. Now they've moved into a thing that I put in here, the Darfur Women Network. They're supporting an initiative to make these clay stoves, which I think are very cool, and by the women in Darfur, and handing them out to women who need them. So I don't know what they're cooking these days. I think that these kind of initiatives are really important because the whole infrastructure of the country is ruined. I don't know the status of electricity, for example, but the habit of the Sudanese is usually to cook in a I don't know what to call it, a stand-up oven. I don't know how the Darfur Women Network has been distributing these. I don't know how far they've gotten, but they made a lot of them. Anyway, solar, it would be a nice option if there were supplies delivered to make them. They're easy to make.
And one of the reasons the solar cookers are so important is because otherwise the women go outside the refugee camps to pick up the firewood, or the pieces of stick to make the fire, and then they get raped. And
Right.
that's the highest incidence of rape the minute you get out on your own to go pick up firewood. So that was one of the solutions that was brought into to use during the original Sudanese conflict. There's another question here. Um, Susan, how did your work, actually two questions, how did your work with the women and children overlap with that of UNICEF when it came to their protection and aid?
Oh, funny story there. Again, the organization I was working for is Darfuri led and based in the U.S., but functioning with people on the ground in Darfur. We at the time had been, I don't know how much this has changed. We're 20 years downstream now, but I remember distinctly that we had requested from UNICEF their classroom in a box, because there were a lot of schools in rural Darfur that really needed supplies, and we were trying to pay teachers to come and actually educate the kids. And the Sudanese have placed great value on the education of their children. And so we got some from UNICEF. It was delivered. I don't know how it was delivered. It came in a truck. The things were put together, like notebooks, pencils, rulers, some other classroom objects, in these big boxes that over the course of their transit had been thrown around enough so that they were leaking supplies out of the sides, right? And then I looked at it and I said, you know what? Everything in this box could have been bought locally. Everything. The only thing they couldn't get was the notebook stamped with UNICEF on it. So I'm thinking that one of the other things that really has to be considered when you help is, what can you do with local resources? Why haul in at great expense, 10 boxes of school supplies when you could have bought it locally? How much did it cost to send from Amsterdam or wherever it was sent? These kind of, and the benefit of actually buying something locally means that you're supporting the local economy. We built the Women's Center with all these, they use these long mats for walls. We went one day when we were in a mood to finish what's the word I'm looking for? Renovating this old building that we were going to make the center in. We went to the local people that made these mats and bought them out. Oh, you've never seen people so happy. That's what you do with a local economy. You buy what you need locally. And I really have a bone to pick when everybody brings in their stuff. Don't bring in your stuff. Buy local. And it works, in the US too. But in general, what I worry about most is that the Sudanese are not seen as the people, as people in need. Like, they're our neighbors, our world neighbors, but not that close, but they're our neighbors. And how would you help a neighbor? Would you help a neighbor? That's another question. Will you help your neighbors? And how can you help them? You, first of all, as Jill said, you've got to listen. What are they saying? And can you even hear them for all the other noise? How do you get a pipeline to those people? Well, you go to locally run organizations. This is the thing. If they're going to ever overhaul the humanitarian development, relief and development industry, they've got to go local. They've got to be able to equip the local organizations with both the knowledge and the stuff, the equipment, the technology to become big enough to make a difference.
I have another question in the chat. There are two more that I have. One, Wendy asked, she's curious about birth control. Is it available?
I have no idea. I would think not.
And then Joan asked, what's the source of heat in a clay stove?
I believe it's charcoal. It might be charcoal. They make charcoal.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other question.
I could be wrong about that. I'll look it up.
Good. And then you can send it in the follow-up email next week. That's what we always do. We always have the afterthoughts or the questions that don't get answered. And somebody has their hand up. Spence, go for it.
Okay, so like I'm gonna come from this and be like, wow, this is amazing. Like something is happening. We need to do something. Tell people about what's going on. When I talk to my friends and family in the US, like I know what they're gonna say. They're gonna say, we're already caring about so many other things that are happening. We're exhausted from like compassion fatigue. We don't have bandwidth to, learn about another thing that's happening. I'm just wondering, like, what would you say to them, or what would your message be? Because I obviously have my thoughts, but you've been dealing with this for a lot longer than me.
Well, of course, there's a lot of battles to fight. You've got to pick them. I think that I can't pay, for example, as enough attention focusing on this crisis, which is so vast. I can't really spend a whole lot of time understanding what's happening in Yemen, for example, which is also a really bad crisis. I know more about Gaza because it became the story after Ukraine. But when something bubbles up and rises to today's headline news, then people pay attention, but only for a while until it passes out of the news cycle. I think that you got to pick the thing that resonates the most with you. Other people may notice that you're engaged in this way, and they might ask you questions, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily want to do anything. They might be doing something else that they really care about, putting their time, money, whatever, in the US or internationally. I think you pick your battle, and battle might be the wrong word. You pick the thing that you want to see changed, and then you work toward that. And you enlist people, I think, not so much directly, but by your enthusiasm and your dedication, that people go, oh, wow, she's really into this thing. I want to find out a little more. I think you inspire people by your own commitments, and you can't really ask them to take on more if they don't want to. They just won't.
What I was going to say, Spence, from having worked in the international field, is it's just like right now climate change, because we have so many chronic disasters in the United States with floods and fires and you name it, and hurricanes and so on, is you get exactly what you're talking about, compassion fatigue. But when you give people an opportunity to see a way that they personally can solve it, and I remember years and years ago, the Measles Initiative, the Measles, which is now called the Measles Partnership, Measles Rubella Partnership. I didn't know how to educate people about that there were 450,000 children dying in Africa alone of measles, more than malaria and more than TB. But what I did is, when I had my birthday party, I said, don't give me any gifts. just write a check out to the measles initiative. And people said, what is the measles initiative? And then I educated them, and then they got excited about it. And I'm using that as an example, but it could be anything. It's if you can figure out a way to make it relevant, or a way that you give opportunity for them to figure out a way to give, whether that's money, whether that's going for a march, whether that's going to a fair, an educational fair, or refugee day event, whatever it is, you give them an opportunity to participate, because it's the opportunity to participate that makes a difference in all of us. If we just hear something that's overwhelming, we get overwhelmed by it all the time. I'm overwhelmed by Yemen, by Syria, that's still going on, 12, 13, 14-year war. All of them. I'm overwhelmed by all of them. But if I talk to somebody who's from that country, and they tell me a little bit about it, and then I get excited, and I said, well, what do you think they need, blah, blah, blah. And then I go, oh, the light goes on, and then I think about it. And so it's like being in the moment almost with whoever you meet who educates you about something. And that's why I love doing these discussion groups, because it educates you, and then you can take off on a platform and decide what you want to participate in. I don't know if that helps, Vince.
Yeah, that is spot on. You have to get excited about doing something, and education is a big part of that. It's a big part of it.
Thank you. Yeah. For me, sorry, turn my camera. For me, that's really motivational. And with Joanne, we're going to be doing a presentation. Obviously, me virtually, but her in the Seattle area about IHL and talking about the conflicts around the world. And yeah, like I want to get you guys' perspective, because like I did a presentation in December on IHL, and it was just like the standard born in the battlefield. And I felt like at the end of it, it was sort of like, what's the call to action? Like, what's the, like, what are we doing about this? So it's great to hear, like, supporting local communities, listening to people who have been impacted by conflict zones. Like, I like the suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, and also what I know that really helps. Joan, could you mute yourself, please? Thank you, dear. I think what helps are the personal stories.
Yes.
If you intersperse the personal stories along with even more his rules, it brings people home to it, because the connection you make with the other person speaking is always what they listen to. Does that make sense, Spence? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. I think like it's one thing to tell a story, like yeah, like my mom is part of a storyteller guild, like, so like I was telling her, I was like, I want to tell stories as part of the presentation. But if you have like a story and it's like, oh, like this thing happened, it's one thing. If it's like, I talked to somebody and they told me like this happened to them, it's another. If it's, like Susan, like, like actually going there and like being in that place. Like for me here in Colombia, like I met a former child soldier who went through a rehabilitation program and became a neighborhood security watch person. And it was like, what a great way to like take his traumatic experience and channel it into something that was really positive, and he could like contribute to the community. So but like those kind of moments, like I think that's like really what brings it alive, is like having that personal connection.
Absolutely, you're so right on, Spence. That's so correct. Yeah. Any other questions? Wait a second, I have to look through the questions here. Somebody just put, Susan, you put a whole bunch of resources.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, and then somebody said, thanks so much for the presentation. I look forward to the follow-up email next week. And here, Brev said she's currently a student interested in international public policy. what changes or considerations what changes or considerations can be made that would help non-Western countries have more of a voice during these types of conflicts? Tough question. I'm going to read it to you again. I'm currently a student, Bev said, I'm currently a student interested in international policy. What changes or considerations can be made that would help non-Western countries have more of a voice during these types of conflicts?
Well, this is an ongoing conversation, which is couched in the words localization. This is the buzzword in the industry right now. How can we localize the response? And the way it normally works is, for example, USAID is very vocal about this, but is not quite able to get beyond, well, we have, I'll just pick one. International Rescue Committee is our point person in this country, so we're going to send the money through them, which isn't quite localization. It's like you've got to find somebody that's not a sub-grantee, but a grantee, right? And so to the UN itself, I mean, look at who runs the show. The Security Council falls over itself to block every good thing that comes out of, every good idea that comes out of, that they should be supporting, because Russia doesn't like it or the US doesn't like it. Or you've got to make that a rotating, I mean, that's one idea. You've got to make it a rotating Security Council boss. Wouldn't you love to see a small country in the position that Russia once occupied or the US once occupied, calling the shots? Would that be different? Yes, it would be different. Localizing has been on my mind since I worked in Darfur 20 years ago, and I think it's finally being talked about a lot more, but the progress is very slow. I think you have to support. If you want to be involved in a particular area of, say, you want to support work in Sudan, you have to know who's working there. You have to make the commitment to do the research and find out. Sometimes you're wrong. Yeah, but in any country, there are people, I can guarantee you this, there are people who care enough to set up a small organization to take care of the needs of their country people. So find them, support them, help them. That's where the money should go. That's what USAID believes. Let's see if they can do it.
And I'm wondering, Susan, if you would be willing to put your email where people can reach you if they have further questions,
Sure.
or if they're interested in the things that you have been talking about. And also, if you'd put your books in there, I think it'd be really wonderful. Here, let me see what else is got written. Joanne asked if you have materials that can be served as a curriculum for the local Holocaust Center. She's going to do a training program in the area where she said 80 teachers showed up to save Darfur. Maybe that can happen again. She'd like to create it again. So maybe you can be in touch with Joanne Darfur. And if you put your email down.
I don't know anything about the curriculum from back then, because Save Darfur, after a while, they disappeared.
Yeah, but I think if you have information that may be useful, or maybe your PowerPoint.
I don't, but I can look.
Oh, good. Okay.
A curriculum on exactly what?
What she said is years ago, she did a curriculum for 80 teachers showed up to save Darfur, which was the name of the talk. Maybe that can happen again. Maybe she can create that again. That's what Joan is saying.
I'm not.
Okay.
I think I get the drift, but the Save Darfur movement was strange. It was.
Okay,
And I don't know. I don't know. Yeah,
I want to check if anybody has any comments or any information that they wanted to impart, either about Darfur or what they felt about this talk. Any questions or comments or further discussion? This is your time to share with Susan. And somebody has Chris,
Chris.
Christine, I think it is. You have your hand up? Go for it.
Yes. Susan, how many different local groups did you have to work with to get things done for the people in Sudan? Like, I know that when the American Red Cross groups go in, you have a certain segment that you deal with. You find out from the local sector uh, who you need to deal with as far as this for this part of the things for the ladies, what other group you need to deal with for certain parts. How many did you have to coordinate with to get everything done that you needed to do?
Well, that's an interesting question. It would take a long time for me to answer, because finding the right places to get stuff that you need was a was a real challenge. There was the peacekeeping force that was in the town where the women's center was in Darfur, Khartoum town, and they sent a whole bunch of people from, I don't know which African, I think it was South Africa. None of them spoke Arabic, which was a real liability in an Arabic speaking location. They, that's too long a story. I'm sorry. I'm going to back up here. the things that you can get, you usually have to go begging. Actually, the UN tends to have the most stuff. Like one time, I had to go to the forgot which organization it was. One of the UN organizations. They had a warehouse in El Fasher, I think it was, and
UNHCR, probably.
I'm not sure, but in any event, the warehouse was full of different kinds of blankets, and it gets cold at night in high desert, and so I went to them and I said, I have this women's center and there's X number, I forgot how many. I wanted a couple hundred blankets, right? And they said, oh, we've already taken care of them. And I said, no, you haven't actually. And I really want 200 blankets. And they said, we'll give you 100. I said, I'll take it. And I had to beg for it, for real. And then I took it to the women, and they're used to these really heavy quilty things that they make. And these were little fleece blankets. And they looked at me skeptically. And they came back the next day and said, those are great. They really worked. You have to go begging in a lot of these environments to get the things you need from the UN. Certainly, I don't know about the other organizations, but I had a lot of experiences which made me skeptical. All my sacred cows were slaughtered during that time. I guess I could put it that way. I'm not a pessimist, but I don't believe that things are always what they seem.
Did you have to deal with any of them? Did you have to deal with any local groups, say as liaisons between you and the women themselves in order to get approval to speak to them, like the male members of the society, to make sure it was within their religious laws or local laws like that?
Well, the great part of the organization that I worked for was that it was led by a Darfuri who knew all these people, more or less. And so, of course, you go and you convene these people and you say, this is what we're here for. What do you think? You always have to go to the leaders, whether or not they can help you. You don't know that, but what you do want to do is be respectful enough to honor their leadership and say, I've come to you because I want you to know what I'm doing here. And I would really like your support. And maybe they'll support you, but best case, they'd support you. Or just stay out of the way. Just don't interfere. There are highly structured, Sudanese society is highly structured, actually. The sheikhs and sheikhs, and you don't want to step on people's feet. You really have to know the power structure and honor it. And then they may help you by connecting you with somebody else. But always, always, always in a situation like this, you really want to go to the leaders. Take me to your leaders. It's a really good way to start. And if you can get an audience with the INGOs that have shown up, that's harder.
Thank you.
There's a couple more questions or comments in the chat that I'm going to read.
That's a good idea. Department of
Wonder
Public.
what % of Darfur Women Network is health related? In other words, need birth control or other health benefits, I would imagine.
I don't know that organization well. I know the woman who started it. We don't keep in touch. I just know of her. Their birth control. I don't know. How do you deal with that when rape is so prevalent? It's not a thing that is discussed in Sudanese society, I don't think. Maybe in doctors' offices, but yeah, you might think, yeah, we want birth control, but we're talking about rape. We're talking about rape. I mean, I read about one woman who was gang raped and was pregnant with twins. And did she not want to have them? These kind of things.
Was she on birth control, or was it against her religion? I'm sorry, I just don't understand, having never been there.
Even if she, I don't know that, using birth control is against anybody's religion. The accessibility of it is one thing. In the current situation, nobody's getting any kind of medications or drugs of any kind.
Wow.
Nobody.
Well, that's huge right there.
Yeah,
that's huge.
It's huge.
What I would say is, Wendy, one of the places that you could do the research in is the World Health Organization, because they do the epidemiology of different conflict zones, and they also work on vaccinations and such. CDC to some extent, but I would say go to the World Health Organization within the UN, and they're probably one of the best resources for those kind of statistics, because what do you call it? Not incidentally, but what Susan is saying is that's not a thing that, in her experience, when she was working in the refugee camps or working with peace and development, that they talked about. That was not one of the options. The option was how to survive rape, how to keep their children alive, how to feed themselves, and how to stay warm,
Yeah.
or protected. Yeah.
And again, accessibility of those of birth control is, I think, is minimal.
Christine, your hand is still up. Do you have it up for a reason? Nope. I guess not. Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? We're sort of winding up now. I would love to know how this has worked for you. Is this been a topic that's been useful? Are you happy that you're here? Feel free to comment in the chat or raise your hand. But basically, if you have any questions, now's your time to ask it before we wind down. Jean, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you, Susan, for making a difference in people's lives. And Jill and Mia, this is such a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much for including me. And thank you both also for making a difference in people's life by holding such presentations.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Jill.
you.
I love that.
Anybody else want to share anything before? Oh, looks like Jane Reader Katz. You have your hand up? Jane, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? Jean? Your hand is up. Or did you just speak?
Oh, I'm sorry. I already said my piece.
Oh, okay.
I have to take it down. I'm so sorry.
No worries. I'm just slow at this. That's all. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions before we wind down? We'll attempt to sometime by the end of next week send you a note with the recording and a link. It'll be on a YouTube Red Cross link that the public can have access to. And also any additional resources that Susan and I think about between now and then that might be helpful to you. And any unanswered questions, hopefully we'll get to those as well. So going once, going twice.
You're so cute.
Going 3.5 times, going 4.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank
and
you
Jill.
all for being here. You've been wonderful. Thank you, Linnea, for being the tech support on this.
Yes, thanks, Linnea.
And thank you,
Thank you,
Susan, for being so present. It's a joy to see you. Yeah. Take good care, and I'll stay on, and Susan will stay on for a couple more minutes if people have anything they want to share. And I just got another text saying amazing talk from Leslie to you. So there you are.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.